Eu gostaria de convidar a Louise Page, que é Chief Innovator Office da PLOS, Board Member of Open Access Scholarly Publications Association, and Advisory of Board Member of Electrochemical Society.
Hola. That's about it. Thank you very much, of course, to Abel and to SciELO for inviting me to come and speak. Thank you to the translators for making me sound smarter than I am. Take as much liberty as you'd like. So I will be speaking about universal open access, trying to answer the question, are we there yet? So if any of you have children, you know that this is the kind of question you get all the time. Are we there yet? And the answer, of course, is no. The answer is, of course, do we even know where there is? And so I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I talk a little bit about the history of where we all came from and how much we need to unwind, how much we need to overcome in our quest for open access. And so first of all, we all know that the creation of research, the creation of information is in fact a dynamic process. It's the one where it's collaborative, it's global, it's iterative, and it has a lot of trial and a lot of error. But yet, we have somehow managed to change it in such a way that the publishers and publishing have elevated the kind of discourse that is worth sharing, that is worth disseminating. And that kind of conversation has really changed what research has become. So research in itself is not article-shaped. Researchers have to leave the bench, they have to leave their work in order to write something that is shaped like an article that a publisher will accept. And I think that that's something that we really need to look at. How can we change that? And it's all baked into what is at the core a broken incentive system. So we are rewarding people for novelty and for ingenuity in very, very selective journals. And that creates a cycle where it's very hard to break. And it does, and these are meant to look like shackles for a reason, because the content is locked and the power is locked in people who have been running the system for years, centuries. And so the younger, more vulnerable researchers who could benefit the most from an open environment don't have the power to change it. And those that are in roles of power don't have incentives to change it. So we are locked in this vicious cycle. So let's talk about 1993. So give or take 1993, that's when the internet exploded into all of our lives. And in a real way, I mean, in many places, in institutions and at very large organizations, they had intranet, they had ways of sharing information. But for us, you know, for the common consumer, how we shop, how we find information, how we communicate with one another, the internet changed everything. And I think that that is such a fundamental part of where we came from and why we're all here, is because that land rush and that land grab that happened on the internet 25 years ago is what is still swinging now, is still what is driving so much of what we do now. And this is where SciELO is so special. Because instead of building walls, instead of saying, no, you know, you can't have access, I'm going to recreate my subscription model online, SciELO said, no, we're going to do it differently. And I think that's where this group is very, very different from the rest of the world. And this is some of the challenges that we have in North America and in Western Europe, is because of this land grab that happened so long ago. And the question is, how much can we control? How much can we change? Is it an evolution or is it a revolution? And in many ways, doing it piece by piece, bit by bit, actually changing one thing at a time rather than throwing everything away and saying start over again. Maybe there is some method to that madness that does make sense. So I'm here from the Public Library of Science, And I was very happy to see Harold Varmus's introductory remarks, because Harold was one of our 3 founders, and they are, without question, 3 of the most revolutionary people I've ever met. They are ingenious, they are brilliant, and they are visionary. And what they saw was a role that an organization like PLOS could take in changing that conversation around open access and about the universality of content and information and knowledge and how that could be shared. And so we were formed 17 years ago, and in a way, we certainly were not the first doing open access. I mean, there are many more before us. But we did it in a way that demonstrated a kind of scale and a kind of sustainability that really hadn't been demonstrated before. And yes, we do trade in APCs, and yes, we do trade in articles. And in many ways, after 17 years, we've started to become what we didn't want to be, and that is a major publisher. And so, you know, when we were first founded, they didn't really want to have journals, but there wasn't a vehicle to really push open access without a journal 17 years ago. So they introduced a journal with open access. That was the change. Then they introduced a journal where they changed the assessment model and made it about sound science and not about selectivity, and that became PLOS One. So they changed one thing at a time. So what else can we change? What else can we do in order to really move things forward? And the one thing that we have encountered is that open access is good business. And so one of the things that in our quest to be sustainable and to be scalable, what we also proved is that there was a lot of money, and there was a lot of money out there in the author's wallet that they were willing to pay. And so that got co-opted by many of the large publishers, who then introduced their variations of the cascade, their variations of the hybrid. Then, of course, the bad news started coming out around predatory publishers and around Sci-Hub and around double dipping. And we've gotten all this noise now around open access that is really very unfortunate, because that is not what open access has been about. And so as we move forward, we need to think about how are we really going to make a difference. But as we move forward, we also have to think about how things are changing. So I'm assuming you know who that is. We have a very different landscape, and it's amazing how in just almost 2 years, our landscape in the United States has changed so much. Truth is under attack. Science is under attack. Facts are under attack. And so the world and the community that we talk to, that we live with, they're starting to question whether or not those of us who work so diligently in making sure that knowledge gets out, whether or not that's really true, and questioning those facts. There's an enormous percentage in the United States who do not believe in climate change, which is why as we fire up the coal machines again, we're really turning back time. And so we need to work together in many, many different ways in order to achieve the greater good, the things and the changes that we all seek. And so I want to introduce the idea of co-opetition. There is the idea where there's cooperation, and then there's competition. But we have a shared goal together. We have a shared need to really move things forward. And the way that SciELO has done that, with working with the funders, with the institutions, with all of the researchers in a way that moves that bar, that changes that conversation, is something I would very much like to see the rest of the world embrace. So we do absolutely have differentiators between us as publishers, that we want to be sustainable and that we want to do good, but there are ways that we share so many things underneath the hood that we really could move forward together much faster and more effectively. So I'm just going to go through a few of them in the minutes that I have left. So number one, as I go back to that first slide, we have to change the incentives. We have to improve the incentive system. It is far too difficult and far too important that the article right now is in fact the thing that people trade on. But the methods, the pieces, the components of the research are in fact the knowledge. And so how do we elevate them as actual first-class research objects that people can get credit for, that people can get rewards for? And so how can we also find ways to reward failure? If you find that you have a null result or a negative result or a confirmatory result, those things are just stuck in drawers. How do we know? Research just keeps puddling along, reinventing the same wheel in many cases. So how do we make sure we reward failure so that reproducibility crisis is something that we can actually make some headway? And then we also need to find, of course, more and better metrics. I mean, the advantage of coming on after several days of so many amazing presentations is that I don't need to remind you guys that this is something that really needs to change. Data. Open access allows everyone to access research. Open data allows everyone to do research. This is an incredibly important and core part of what is the component and what is in the underlying nature of the content and the research that we do. And since 2014, PLOS has had an open data policy. And so as of maybe last month or the month before, we crossed 100,000 open data sets. And so we have a data availability statement for all of this content. That is very significant. We require this. You cannot publish in PLOS unless you have given us an open data availability statement. And we actually thought quite a lot of people would say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's, I'm risking too much. And in fact, it has been practically nil that have said, I won't do it. Our submissions have still stayed steady. It did not drop as a result of this policy. And more publishers are adopting it. It has not taken off as much as we would really like in terms of it being a core requirement, but it's moving forward. Mainstreaming peer review transparency. Peer review is a locked system. It's very double-blind. It can be very private. And in fact, it does represent a bastardization of the true conversation that happens around research on a regular basis. So how do we increase that transparency? How do we make sure that we all understand what's happening behind the scenes, where this research came from, what kind of dialogue happened to bring it to where it is? And so how can we disaggregate the assessment of the work from the actual publishing of the work? And that's a challenge, and that's something that we all can play a part in doing that. And so one of the places where PLOS has tried to make a difference is around preprints. And so preprints, I completely agree, everybody has talked about preprints, are in fact the change, the one change that could really bloom and could really make a huge difference. And so what PLOS has done is that we give every one of our journals and all of our authors the option to be published in bioRxiv. And so what we do then, for those who opt in, is that we do our screening. We actually go through that the beginning part of that peer review process in as little as 48 hours, and then that paper is sent to bioRxiv for posting. And we have sent over 1,000 over there in the last few months. So it has been something that is growing. It is something that we are constantly educating our authors about and our researchers about, because there's still a lot of noise in the system about, do you want to do that? Will you get published in PNAS? Should you do that? Will you get scooped? We need to work together in order to change that conversation. We've talked a little bit, I know that Michael and Oliver talked a bit about the idea of having an open, networked, dynamic, living article. The idea that within the article, things could obviously change, that things like protocols, like methods, like data, like tables, that they could be updated over time and actually change within the article, so that somebody who's reading this can actually get more information and understand how it's evolving in a dynamic way. Not that you have to publish another article, that you have to do another citation. So we keep it all within that same corpus. So these are things that as we we embrace data, as we embrace all of the different kinds of commenting and assessment, and we try to make all of that more transparent, that the article then can be more of that conversation piece that is more like what research is meant to look like. We've all talked about infrastructure, and this is without question one of the key components of what PLOS needs and what every publisher needs in order to be successful. When I talked about the internet booming in 1993, that is where a great deal of our infrastructure still exists. We are still trading on technology that is over 20 years old. Of course, it's been upgraded, of course, it had been refreshed, but there are components of it that are very, very old. And as we try to interoperate, as we try to change that momentum, as we try to use standards in a way that really allow all of us to raise the water level, we have to change that infrastructure so that we can all work together in those ways. And so those are things around open source, certainly around open technology, and sharing amongst ourselves what are best practices. Those are the kinds of things that we can do to really make change, that we can really leapfrog beyond where the commercial publishers are right now. And one of our experiences at PLOS has been that we developed a manuscript system. We spent years and millions of dollars working on a manuscript system that was open source, that was meant to achieve some of these higher aims. And it was very hard to do. And some of the bets that we made in the technology didn't pan out. And so we had to turn away from it. But that doesn't mean it isn't still needed. It does mean, though, that it probably does make more sense that we do it with others, that we do it as a collaboration, and that we do it as a coalition. Speaking of coalition, I know that everybody here has heard a little bit about Plan S, and this is also the attempt by the European Commission and by the European community to really move forward with their agenda around open access and to say loud and clear, hybrids are not open access. They don't count. And that is forcing the conversation. But what is interesting to me as a gold open access publisher is that it's also changing the form of the big deal. There's a new form of the big deal now that is emerging around the APC, which could be as dangerous as the original big deal. And so the idea that institutions and countries will lock and dedicate a certain amount of money to a certain publisher because they have spent that much money with them in the past is just another form of budgeting that locks out the open access publisher, the gold open access publisher, the ones who have been trying to do good all this time. So I'm going to read this to make sure that everybody can hear it. The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. And I want to close with that. I'm hoping that I have sparked some interest in how we may work so well together going forward in order to achieve the real changes that we seek. And I will say one thing. I looked this up on the internet, how to say thank you. And that's what it told me to do. So the internet failed me. So, obrigada.